Hello and welcome. My name is James Padolsey, and in this screencast I'll be showing you how to create an image preview jQuery plugin. Right, so as you can see, we've got 5 links within a list, and each of the links is linking to a different image. If I show you the page in Firefox, you'll see it's just very normal. Each of the links goes to a different image, and that's great. What we want to do is create an image preview plugin, which will enable users to see the image in a preview box before they access it. So let's get started. As you can see, we're linking to jQuery at the bottom of our document, as well as imgPreview.jQuery.js. The naming convention here isn't set in stone, so don't worry about it. Some people put jQuery at the front of the name, although I prefer doing it this way. So as you can see, we're linking to all the necessary files. So let's get started. The first thing you want to do when creating a new jQuery plugin is wrap it in a closure, also known as a self-invoking anonymous function. They look like this, and the benefit in them is that even if you can't access jQuery on the outside of the function using the dollar symbol, you can still access it on the inside. This may be because you're using MooTools or Prototype, and both of them make use of the dollar symbol as well. So to protect yourself from any conflicts between libraries, and of course because you'll be sharing your plugin online, hopefully, this is always a good way to start. So we pass jQuery and then we alias it as the dollar symbol, like that. And so now we have access to jQuery via the dollar symbol within our closure. Now, the notation for creating a new jQuery plugin is jQuery.fn and then the name of your plugin. fn is just a shortcut to jQuery.prototype, but we might as well use fn because it's shorter and quicker. And so then you put the name of your plugin, and in this case it's image preview, and of course it's a function. Right. So one of the first things I like to do before I create a jQuery plugin is figure out how I want it to get cooled and the settings I want to pass to it. So if we just plan out how we actually are going to cool this eventually on this page, we're going to be selecting all anchors and calling the plugin, and then we want to pass settings as an object because there'll be quite a few. If you've only got 1 or 2 settings, then you can just pass them as normal parameters. For example, if we wanted to, our plugin might let us set the color of the preview box. It might be red, and then the width of it might be 100. But since our plugin is going to have more settings than that, it's always a good idea to pass a settings object. The benefit is twofold. One, then not all the properties need to be filled, and 2, they're all labeled, so it's clear to anyone who sees the code what's going on. So if I show you this, we'll have label 1 and then whatever the setting is, setting value here. We won't create these yet because we don't know what they're going to be yet. We will eventually. One other thing to note is that we want our plugin to accommodate chaining like this, using any of jQuery's native methods or other plugins. Fundamentally, we want our plugin to be able to accommodate this chaining, and the way to do that is to make sure that our plugin returns a jQuery object. Now, to access the jQuery object within a plugin, it's just this. It's literally the this keyword. In this case, it references the jQuery object. So to return it, obviously, we just have to return this. Right, but before we return anything, we want to define our default settings, and we'll do that in a default settings object here. And the settings we'll be using, we'll have one called image CSS. Now this will be an object of CSS properties which will be applied to the image. By default, it'll be empty, but if the developer who's using the plugin wants to add his or her own styles, then they can do that via this object. It's just a nice little handy helper setting. Another one is distance from cursor. Obviously, you don't want the preview image to be exactly where the cursor is. Well, you might do. This helps you control where the preview image is in relation to the cursor. By default, it's got a top value of 10 and a left value of 10. This means that the preview box will be 10 pixels from the cursor to the left and 10 pixels from the top. The next setting property is on show. This will be run when the preview box is shown. By default, it's an empty function. And then we have on load, which will be run when the image loads. Again, it's an empty function by default. And then there's on hide when the preview box disappears, which is also an empty function. And next, there's the container ID. We want to make as much as we can customizable, but not so much that it ends up making the plugin huge. So you've got to find a nice balance between the two ends. So we've got container ID. This is so they can customize the ID of the container. The image will be within a container div when it's previewed. It won't just be the image showing, and that's what this is. And then there's also a container loading class, which will be applied to the container only when the image is loading, and then will be removed when the image has finished loading. It'll all become much clearer when we go on and code that bit. And by default, this will just be loading. Right, so now we've got our default settings. And of course, the user will pass their settings, so not the user, the developer. So we'll just put we'll call that options. And now we want to merge the two settings objects together, giving the options precedence. So we want to make sure that if properties are passed in the options, they overwrite those which are defined in these default settings. The best way to do that is to define a new settings object. So we've got options, we've got default settings, and now we've got a settings object, which will be a combination of the two. And what we want to do is use jQuery's extend method, and to it we want to pass an empty object, which is the one which will be extended, and then default settings, and then options. What this will do is it will merge these two objects together, giving the options precedence, and it'll put it into a new object which will be accessible through settings. The next step is to define the container. So we're creating another variable called container, and as you can see, it's prefixed with a dollar symbol, which is a nice way of signifying that it's a jQuery object, which it is. We're creating a new div, and to it we're giving it an ID of image preview container. Although obviously we don't want to do it directly, we want to access settings and get it through there. So settings.container ID, and I'm just going to put this down a line so it's easier to read. And then we want to append an image. This will be the image which is actually shown in the preview. And obviously we want to hide it, we want to hide it by default because we don't want it to be visible before it loads. And that'll become clearer later as well. And then we want to append the entire container, this div, to the body. So that should all be working nicely. So if we actually, as you can see, we're calling the plugin down here, which we did earlier. And so if we go and look at Firefox, you won't see anything here. But if I go into the DOM, you'll see that a new div has been added to the DOM, image preview container. It's hidden, and it has an image tag within it, exactly as we specified. Right now it's not doing anything because it's hidden and we haven't told it to do anything, but that will happen next. But before that, what we want to do is just want to create a shortcut to the image, and we'll call it image with a dollar prefix. And so that will be the image within the container, set as its context. Also, while we're at it, we may as well set the image CSS, which is specified in the settings. Right, the next step, I forgot a setting up here called Preload Images, and this is a Boolean value. By default, it's true. and we want to test for it, and if it's true, we want to preload the images before they're needed. So when somebody does eventually hover over one of the links, the image will already be loaded, and so there won't be any waiting time at all. So if settings.preload images, we want to loop through each of, but right now because this is referencing the jQuery object, what we're actually about to loop through are all the anchors of the page as specified here. So let's do that. And now we need some way of testing whether each of these anchors is linking to an image. Now we could test if this is, and then we could test the href attribute to see if it ends with an image extension such as .jpeg, and then we could do another one, .gif. But a better way of doing this, in my opinion, is to create a new selector, or rather a new filter selector. So it could read something like linking to image, and this statement here will now only return true if the link is linking to an image. It won't work yet because we haven't created that new selector. So we're going to do that next. Let's just leave that blank for now. Right up here at the start of our closure, we're going to define a new filter selector. The way to do that is to create a new property under expression : and as I said, it will be called linking to image, and it's a function. This function will be run on every single element that's put through the filter, and each element is passed in the first parameter, and we're going to call it LM, short for element, and then the index is passed to the second parameter. We don't need to use that. And then the third parameter is match. We don't need to use that either, but it's still good to know. Right, so we want to test whether the whether the link's href is linking to an image. But first, we need to confirm that it is actually an anchor that we're talking about. So we want to test whether LM is an anchor, and then we want to make sure that it has an href attribute, and then we want to test that href attribute. We'll create a new regular expression here, and what we want to do is we want to match an extension, and it has to be JPEG, GIF, or BMP, or PNG. And so obviously we're looking for a period, and following that we need one of the following: GIF, JPEG, PNG, or BMP. Obviously there are lots of other image formats, but these are the most popular, and then an optional E. Right, and now we want to test the elements href. And so now this entire statement here this entire function will return true if the element passed to it is an anchor, and if it's got an href attribute, and if that href attribute matches this pattern. This pattern isn't entirely correct yet, because if I show you up here, if we have a directory called 1.jpg and then we have another file down here, then that will still match in our regular expression, and we don't want that to happen. So to show that we want the end of the string, we'll put a dollar symbol within our regular expression, and now that should work with all of those links. Right, so now we can use this new selector down here as we have, and obviously this condition will only be met if the element in question complies with this. So it's very useful, and we can reuse it later on in our plugin if we need to. So as I was saying before, we are looking to preload all the images, and the easiest way to do that is to create a new image element outside the DOM, and we want to access it, and then we want to give it a source equal to the href of this. And in this loop, this refers to each particular element that's being looped through. So in this situation, it will loop through each anchor, and then it will create a new image outside of the DOM, and then give that image a source equal to the href of that anchor. Right, the next step is to set up some events. As I said, what we want to happen is for when a user hovers over one of the links, for the preview box to appear, and when they hover out of it, so when they mouse out of the link, it has to disappear. But when they move around their cursor on the link, the preview box has to move with the cursor. And so we will be using the mouse move event, and so let's do that. So on mouse move, we want to set the container. Oh, and before I do this, let me just show you, I've already set up some styles for the container in the CSS style sheet. It's all very basic. We've got it at position absolute, and right now it doesn't have any top or left properties, but we're about to add them on the mouse move event. So on mouse move, we want the container. We want to access the container and change the CSS, the top value. We want to change it to e.pageX, and e is the event object, which we have to pass here. And then obviously we want to add that distance from cursor property that we added in the settings. So settings.distance from cursor, and then we want to access the top property of that. If you look up here, it had a top and left property, and we want to access the top property. Next, we want to specify the left position, which is essentially the same. Right. So every time the mouse is moved over the link, or over any link, the container CSS will be changed accordingly. Now, we don't want to do anything else on mouse move because it happens a lot, and if we do anything too intensive, then it will slow down the browser a lot. So the next event we need to set up is the hover event. The first parameter to the hover method in jQuery is the event handler for the mouse over function, and then the second parameter is the event handler for the mouse out function. You could just write mouse over and then mouse out, but it's just easier if you've got both to do it this way. Right, so the first thing we want to do within this function is set up a reference to the link which is hovered, which will be this within the event handler. And then we want to set a class of loading on the container div. Although it's not always loading, we want to tap into our settings again and find the container loading class. If you remember, we gave it a default value of loading up here, so a class of loading will be added. Right, next what we want to do is set up an event handler for the load event of the image. Just do that here. Now within this load event, we first want to remove the class we just added on the container, because obviously the image would have loaded. So now we want to remove that very class. And next what we want to do is call the onLoad function. Now it's empty, so it won't actually do anything, but if someone uses the plugin and makes the onLoad function do something, then we want it to run when the image loads. So we're just going to call it in here, although we're not going to call it like a normal function like this. We want to call it within a different context. within the onLoad function, we want to have access to the container. Sorry, no, not the container. We want to have access to the image and to the link we just hovered over. So we're going to call it with the image as its context. Sorry, we want to access the actual DOM element, and then as the first parameter, the link. This will become clearer once we demo the plugin and make our own onLoad function. So now that we've set up an event handler, which will happen when the image is loaded, we want to change its source so it can load to the href of the link. And this reminds me, what we're doing here is we're not filtering out the ones that aren't images or aren't linking to images. So again, we want to use that very same selector that we created, linking to image. I think that's it. Yep. And so that will get rid of all the ones that aren't linking to an image and that aren't anchors. Because of course you can call this plugin with anything. You could call it with a div or really anything. So we've got to make sure that the input we're receiving is valid. And now there's another function in our settings we want to run, and that's the onShow setting. We could run it before this, not doing it in any particular order. It's just I just remembered to do it here. And then to that we're going to do that within the context of the container and pass the link as the first parameter. Again, this will become clear what we're doing here when we demo it. So that's all that we want to happen when a link is hovered over. And the next thing we have to define is what to happen on mouse out. And so the first thing is we want to hide the container, and then we want to unbind the load event handler from the image, because otherwise it'll all pile up every time a link is hovered over. And we want to empty the source attribute as well. We could just remove the attribute, but there's no point because we'll be using it again. And then we want to call the onHide function within the settings. Actually, it's exactly the same as what we're doing here. Let's just space this out a bit so it's clearer what's going on. Right, and the very last thing we want to do is to return the jQuery object. And this accommodates any chaining that you may want to do. Right, so now that we've created it, let's test it. As I said before, I've got some basic styles set up, so it should look okay. Let's try it out. Close that. Right, now this isn't working. There's an error, apparently. Right, yeah. Basic syntax error. Let's go in and fix that. Yeah. Oops. Oh, yeah, sorry, one last thing we want to do is we haven't created a reference to the link within this onMouseOut function, so we just want to pass it this instead, which still references the link. And another thing I forgot to do was to show the container, and this is meant to be Y and this is meant to be X. So now let's test the plugin. Right, so as you can see, when we roll over any of the links, the preview shows up and it moves with our cursor, and it's 10 pixels to the right and below the cursor as we specified in the settings. Right, so the next stage, let's add some custom settings to our plugin. We want to make sure that the maximum width of the preview image is 200. And so now if we preview it, it's much smaller, which is much better. And we might also want to set an onLoad function, and this could fade in the image. Sorry, not this. And earlier we called the onload function within the context of the image. This means we can access the image through the this keyword, and then we can animate it. Opacity 1 over 400 milliseconds. But because the image is shown by default, we want to hide it on show, and to access the image, it's the image, and under that, and it's the image within this, and in this function, this refers to the container, as you can see here. So what we're looking for is the image, and then we're going to set its opacity to nothing. And now if we preview that, right, I don't know if you can see that, but the image is fading in very nicely. And so the next thing we can test out is the distance from cursor setting. And if you remember, it takes two properties, a left and a top property. So we're going to set the left to 20 and the top to minus 40. Let's see how that looks. Yep, so as you can see, the image is a little higher in relation to the cursor. And so that's what's great about settings. You can really allow any level of customization. Although remember that the more customization you add, the bigger your plugin will end up being. Right, so that's it. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope you've learned a bit about how to create a jQuery plugin.